Welcome back. I'm Khalil Charles. We've got now Davide Salvi, who'll be doing a review of this week's main online stories in Africa. Davide.
Hi, Khalil. The first story that I have for you is a story of a clash between tradition and faith. It's the story of the grandson of Nelson Mandela, who is the chief of the Mvezo tribe. He just got married for the fourth time in his life with a woman called Rabia Clark, and he became a Muslim. He converted to Islam. But the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa, which is kind of a conservative sort of lobby for, South Africa spiritual leaders, said that there is a conflict between his faith and his role of chief of the Mvezo tribe. So that's why, that's basically because the head of the tribes makes, some Thanksgiving rituals. They are part of, they have to slaughter animals during prayers, and this could present some contradictions with his new faith.
Has he responded to that? Has he made any statements about how he feels about that?
Well, he embraced Islam, so he's quite convinced of his beliefs, and he's a free man, and he wants to be, part of Islam, and he's reiterated that. And, this is a conservative lobby, so they're making his point. But, of course, they also said that he has to be free of embracing whichever religion he wants. They are, although they're making a point saying you have to kind of leave your post because there can be contradictions between your role as a head of the tribe and your religious views.
So the possibility he might abdicate if he's not able to do what he wants to do. That's a very interesting story.
Yeah.
We'll see how that one pans out later on, yes.
Yeah.
What other news have you got for us this week?
The second news that I've got for you is from the Huffington Post, Black Voices, and we move on to the United States, to North Carolina. You probably know that it's Black History Month, and a group of female students are protesting against their school culturally limiting dress code. They wore a head wrap called geles. It's a traditional African head wrap, but the school administrators told that they have to show their hair, so they're not allowing them to wear these geles, this head wrap. The school, of course, is denying any wrongdoing. They said that they haven't threatened to discipline the students if they didn't show their hair, but their parents are protesting. They posted pictures on Instagram, and they even launched a hashtag on Twitter that it's bigger than a head wrap, and they're protesting for their rights.
Indeed. We'll see how that one turns out. We'll keep an eye on that story as we go along. Anything else we got for us? The
third story that I've got for you we move on to Berlin. Meryl Streep, the celebrity, the famous actress Meryl Streep, she is the head of the panel that will judge what's the best movie in the Berlin Film Festival, and she is the president, say, of this jury, which is just formed of white people, white actors and actresses and directors. And of course there's a row going on with the Academy Awards because no black actors and actresses are running for the post of best actor.
A number of actors are boycotting that, aren't they?
A number of them. Spike Lee, the director, has said, he's going to boycott. He's not even going to watch the Oscar. He's not going to be bothered. And Charlotte Rampling, the British actress, she said that this is discriminatory for white actors and actresses to make a point about, not the black being underrepresented in the Oscar Academy. She says she's going. She's actually running for the best female actress post. What did Meryl Streep say is that, we are all Africans, really. So she said we all come from Africa originally. That's a bit of a,
Oh, I see. So she's saying that we all share the same ancestry. Yeah. So therefore, even though it is just a group of white panelists, they all originate from Africa.
Therefore, there is a African representation in the panel, which, it's a bit of a slippery slope.
Indeed, that's not not really taking the issues very seriously.
Yeah, it's not taking the issues very seriously. However, she also said that she is determined to include and reward all sorts of gender, races, ethnicities, and religions when she's not going to take it into account, any religions, race, or whatever, when she will judge what the best movie is going to be.
I think she pointed out that there were a number of women on that board, so therefore women were fairly represented.
There's an Italian actress. There are, I think, a couple of women in that panel. She also said that she's been asked by a reporter if she understood films from the Arab world and North Africa, and she said, and I'm going to quote, "There is a core of humanity that travels right through every culture, and after all, we are all from Africa originally." So she reiterated the point again.
Yeah, indeed. And the final story you got for us today?
I have one final story. You'll probably know that Uganda is going to vote for the parliamentary and local elections on the 18th of February. This is the third time then since the restoration of a multi-party politics in Uganda. Uganda is going to vote in the election. President Yoweri Museveni is seeking to extend his 30 years rule over Uganda. He's one of the longest-lasting presidents in the continent, in Africa, but this time he has to face the opposition of 7 candidates. However, he's very likely to win one more time. There are issues that the campaign is presenting. Human Rights Watch have pointed out that there is an increasingly, the crackdown over free press is increasingly happening, and that the elections are likely not to be completely free in Uganda, but he's set to win one more time.
Okay, well, we'll be following that also. Thank you very much indeed, Davide. Thank you. Now, a new exhibition which explores the cultural legacy of communist countries on the African continent opened last week in London. The exposition details the relationship between the Soviet bloc and socialist African nations during the Cold War period. Adama Munu has more.
A new exhibition called Things Fall Apart at the Calvert 22 Gallery looks at the legacy of cultural relationships between Africa, the Soviet Union and related countries during the Cold War. It aims to examine the relationship between Africans and the Soviet Union in what could be considered a part of 20th century history that few speak about. The exhibition features artists and filmmakers drawing on film photography, propaganda and public art, presenting interdisciplinary reflections on African connections to the Soviet Union.
These are statues in a classic socialist realist style, woman and man and child with their fists raised to the sky. And they look like statues that kind of belong in African socialist or totalitarian countries. What they are statues made by a North Korean factory which has been producing these kind of monumental statues and shipping them to Africa for several decades right now as part of North Korea's own attempts to increase its circle of influence in Africa.
Africans and African Americans did travel to the Soviet Union, particularly in the 1930s. Many African American intellectuals were taken in by Soviet ideology, owing to the rampant racist system of segregation. African Americans were greatly disempowered, exploited and discriminated against, and many of the posters displayed at the exhibition suggest that those who came to Moscow would be treated as equals. The exhibition curator, Dr. Mark Nash, says that Africa and communism's destinies were certainly tied.
Most people wouldn't think that Africa and communism go together, but in 1960-61, there were like 16 countries that became independent, some after violent wars like Algeria, some like Nigeria where it was negotiated, and that provided a window for the Soviet Union to get involved in promoting their notions of socialism, democracy and so on, as opposed to that of the West.
From 1961 to 1992, one of Moscow's most prestigious schools was named after Patrice Lumumba, who fought for the independence of the Republic of Congo. the Patrice Lumumba University recruited and educated scores of leaders, mainly African leaders, and was one of many ways in which the Soviet Union cultivated ties with Africa. One issue that certainly comes out from this is the issue of identity for many Russian nationals of African descent. Some commentators believe that Russia's post-racial idealism is difficult to locate. Could it be that these posters were smokescreens for Russia's underlying race problems? Or can the answer be found in a more liberal post-Soviet setting? If anything, the historical ties between Russia and the African diaspora is enriched and speaks to many, both in political and cultural terms. And the exhibition intends to open up a part of Africa's international relations that few ever think about. Adama, Munu, Africa This Week.
To give us a further insight, Dr. Mark Nash, the exhibition's curator, has joined us in the studio. It's great to have you here. Thanks very much indeed for coming along.
Thank you.
Now, the Russian influence in Africa was quite significant in terms of revolutions that were communist or socialist orientated. How important was reaching Africa for the Russians, do you think?
Well, I think the idea was that in those days, of course, it was the Soviets, so it wasn't just the Russians.
Indeed.
And it was the whole of the communist bloc. And I think what they were doing was really trying to support the independence and liberation movements in the 50s and 60s in the hope that they would be part of turning the world communist. This was the very idealistic internationalist movement, I suppose. And then that, after the Second World War, that became concentrated on helping support the independence and liberation movements in the various African countries.
Do you think that those African countries were perhaps more keen or more wanting to have the Russian influence, given that they were, in a sense, not wanting to have the imperialistic influence, the imperialism that they had under the old colonial masters?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Soviet ideology spoke of liberty, it spoke of democracy, it spoke of freedom in a way, which they didn't have under their colonial masters. So, I mean, I'm using the words really from the French Revolution, but nevertheless, they inspired people in Africa in the same way. So when they got rid of, say, the British from Ghana, it made sense, or the British left, it made sense that they would look somewhere else because they had direct experience of the British. Now, whether it worked out with the Soviets is another matter. It didn't always work out.
Yeah, that's interesting because we're not really sure whether there is still remnants of the socialist or communist movements throughout Africa. Although, of course, across the early 60s, we'd have seen Patrice Lumumba, Sankara, these kinds of people who were very much involved in that. Tell us more about the idea behind the exhibition and why you felt the exhibition was important to do.
Well, I'd worked with this gallery, Calvert 22, a few years ago, and we'd done an exhibition focusing on Russian artists reflecting back on the history of the Soviet Union and so on. And I said to the founding director, Nona Matakova, well, you're selling yourself short in a way because the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries had great influence, not just in Africa, but also in Asia and Latin America, and you could legitimately explore that as part of your art project. So this could indeed be one of a series of exhibitions if they wanted to develop them at Calvert on these themes.
And what was the basic overview that you wanted to reflect?
Well, we started with a very precise set of questions about the scholarship programs which the Russians and others had for students in Africa. You could train as a doctor or as a nurse or as an engineer in Moscow or Leningrad or Berlin.
Yes, indeed. And our viewers will be aware of the Patrice Lumumba University, which was named after the leader who was assassinated in the Congo. Yes. So there were opportunities given as a deliberate attempt to inveigle people, to get people into that.
Yeah, they had what was it? The University of the Toilers of the Earth, which was in a way, designed before the Second World War to actively recruit communist agents. This, I think, was a little bit more liberal. You weren't expected to become communist, but it was assuming that since you'd had a free education, you would take Soviet socialist values back to Africa, and a lot of people did, of course. you know.
So their approach is really pushing it through the ideology rather than having any hands-on approach, because we don't seem to have seen the Russian presence in Africa as you've seen maybe today, the Chinese or the others who've come and settled in Africa. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think first of all they concentrated economically where they could make a big impact. Places like Egypt, the building of the Aswan Dam. Secondly, they didn't want to be overextended and take on the whole of Africa, so they needed partners. And it wasn't just the Soviet Union or Russia. There was East Germany involved in Mozambique, Yugoslavia, which is another story, but really an important story, and of course in Angola, Cuba. And so the Civil War and the war for independence of the Civil War in Cuba was, the Cubans fought and initiated that war, but it was also funded by the Soviet Union, which funded Cuba. So there were a number of different actors in this arena, I would say.
What do you think this exhibition will do in terms of benefiting Africans in understanding that relationship?
Well, I'm not sure it's for Africans in a way. I think it's for a British audience, and it's going to travel to Germany and maybe Portugal, for sort of local European audiences to think again about this Cold War period and to look at that history maybe from a different perspective. And I think it's quite important now we have such negative, quite often justified publicity about Putin and Russia to look back and say, well, there was a period when things were different, when you could believe in the possibility of socialism in another country, the Soviet Union, even if you didn't have it at home in Germany or France or the UK.
Indeed, that's a very important message. In terms of the exhibition, the things, what kind of things struck you in that in the exhibition? I guess there's a lot of things, but can you perhaps mention a few that you felt were very important?
One of the, I think the most interesting ones for me is this big wall newspaper that we've constructed using images from the Algerian Civil War. And the story behind that is that this Yugoslav filmmaker, when he was a teenager, worked for the partisans. Then he traveled to Algeria to help create a sort of internet, early version of the internet, to show the soldiers what it was like to fight. So it was like, you know, it was a kind of form of social media, if you like. And we've recreated that on one of the walls of the gallery. But they're all, I mean, the one that I think most people find immediately interesting are these 3 screens of clips of North Koreans' involvement in Africa, because I think that's probably the most obscure story, how North Korea invested a lot of money in that.
A little bit about that. North Koreans in Africa, what was the nature of that involvement?
Well, after the Korean War, then the North Koreans really wanted to be international recognition, and they also wanted to be taken seriously by the Soviet bloc and to have this influence in Africa. And they opened a lot of diplomatic missions, more so than the South. And so they contributed monuments, hospitals, all kinds of infrastructure to these developing countries, a little bit like China is doing this today. I mean, they were trying the soft power approach. I don't think they're doing so much in present day, but the company that made all these sculptures has just opened a big one in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. So there is still another side to what North Korea does, apart from these dreadful missile launches and so on.
Okay, we've got a couple of pictures here that perhaps you can comment on for us. The first one you'll see coming up. That was from the 1920s, I think. And you can see there, what exactly does that relate to?
Well, this is one of 200 or 300 images of black people in Soviet popular culture. The general theme of that part of the exhibit was that at that time, in the 1930s, the Soviet Union wasn't a racist country as far as black people were concerned, And so a lot of black technocrats traveled over to the Soviet Union. There were 3,000 or 4,000 people a year. They traveled to the south of the Soviet Union to help with the cotton crop, and a number of them stayed because actually the Jim Crow laws in the States made life very unpleasant as a black American, but in Russia you would be treated as an equal citizen. And these images that we have in the exhibition sort of celebrate that.
Indeed. How do you think they were treated at that time? Would they have been included as part of the revolution? Would they be part of the communist ideology?
Oh yeah, people say that they were treated very well. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't racism, but just as in a way, racism against black people was a product of the 19th century, because racism was originally to do between white people, in fact. It was relatively recently, but nevertheless, in the Soviet period, they say there wasn't much racism. The racism came in when the Soviet Union began to collapse economically, and it was still investing a lot of money in Africa, and a lot of people in Russia felt that too much money was being spent on these privileged black students, people coming to Russia who were getting a better deal than the local people, I suppose.
We have in fact got one more picture we'd like to show you, and
sure.
Perhaps you can explain to us what this one's about. We can see here that right in the middle of the photograph is a black person, but those around them, perhaps you can explain more.
Well, this looks again, you know, like celebrating industrial workers. I mean, you've got the picture of Lenin, obviously. And as I say, I think black people were just treated as equals, but special because they had been enslaved in the United States. They kind of represented the idea of revolution, because Russia could liberate black people in the present, just as Russians had become liberated from Tsarism. So there was that kind of special focus. And a number of important black actors, Paul Robeson is the best known, stayed in the Soviet Union but was much criticized in the West. And another one, Wayland Rudd, also stayed. And you'll find that there are some black celebrities still in Russian entertainment today whose families go back to that time. Well, I think I wanted people to think again about our political organization today, and think about whether there are other ways that things can be done. In particular, we haven't spoken about it, but with the Yugoslav examples, where Yugoslavia tried, together with a number of African countries, to create a third bloc. It's called the non-aligned movement. They wanted, in a way, to overcome these two power divisions. So I guess it's kind of reflecting on that political history, but using contemporary art to do it.
Okay, Dr. Mark Nash, thank you very much indeed for coming on to the programme and discussing a fascinating relationship between Soviet Union and Africa. Well, that's it for this week. We've come to the end of the programme. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining the show, and you at home for watching. Now, would you believe that in Nigeria, polo has been played there for almost 114 years? Well, the Lagos Polo Tournament kicked off on Thursday this week, attracting top players from all around the world. Organisers say this tournament will be a chance to show off the newly refurbished clubhouse and the newly laid playing surface. We'll leave you with scenes of this, and God willing, we'll see you next week.